Hello, all. Welcome to our third session for today on the topic Marketing Beyond Boundaries Building Customer Connections Through Localization and Vernacular Outreach. Before I introduce our speakers, would first like to thank our partners for extending their support for this event. Thanking the presenting partner Magnon Group, media partner What's Hot, broadcast partner NewsX, digital media partner Agency Reporter, talent partner Talent Track, and publishing partner Appreciate Books. So we have three experts on this topic who will join us as speakers. The first speaker I'd like to invite is Naveed Akil, Managing Director at Magnon Sankers, part of the Fortune 200 Omnicom Group. Naveed will also be moderating this panel. Please allow me to give a brief introduction. Hi. Naveed is an entrepreneur with over 15 years of experience in client acquisition, client onboarding, and leadership development. Currently, Naveed leads the localization and language services arm of Magnon, which is an over 130-member unit servicing some of the world's largest brands. Welcome to the panel, Naveed.
Hey, Bhakti. Thank you so much. Hey, everyone.
The next speaker I'd like to invite is Mr. Chris Horson, Chief Executive Officer at Mother Tongue, providing transcreation, translation, insight, and content services for global brands. Chris has partnered with numerous blue chip names over the years. He works to deliver brand voices that are authentic and credible locally, the most effective way of driving international engagement. Hi, Chris. Welcome to the panel.
Thank you, Bhakti. Hello. Hi, Naved. Hello, everybody.
Hey, Chris.
The next speaker I'd like to invite is Mr. Chandan Mukherjee, Global Head of Consumer and Marketplace Insights at Nestle. He is responsible for leading human and market-centric understanding as an input into strategy development, identification of opportunities, and brand building the Nestle way. Previously, he was a member of the management committee of Nestle India and led development of the market business strategy and consumer insights, which drove the implementation of a transformational growth strategy. Welcome to the panel, Chandan.
Hi, thank you, Bhakti. Hi, Naved. Hi, Chris. Hi, everyone.
Hey, hi.
So we are looking forward to the session. Over to you, Naveed.
Thank you, Bhakti. And welcome again, Chris and Chandan. Thank you for joining us for this event, for this session also. Very interesting session, I feel. Marketing beyond boundaries. Boundaries we humans have defined, but going beyond that, essentially, I think building connections through localization and vernacular outreach. And what a panel to have. On one side, we have a brand, Chandan, representing Nestle and talking about, what Nestle aspires from localization. And on the other, we have Chris from the agency side, who's also been working with a lot of brands on their localization side. And we come in, of course, Magnon Sankers comes in with the India expertise here of localization and, what we can do and what we've been doing with a lot of clients here. So, just to set the context of this session, I think as reading a lot online and, the global trend today that goes around localization is, and it's a list of the top 5 global trends is e-commerce localization, e-learning translation or localization. Then there is transcreation, which is taking a lot of, visibility. Then there is medical translation, which has always been there. And a representation across genders. That's something that has come up very recently and has come up very strong. So those are the latest trends of what the world is doing in localization. E-commerce, e-learning, which again, also big in India, globally as well. What we'll do is we'll start with what your take is on the topic, what you think it really means, marketing beyond boundaries. What is your take of it? Why do brands really localize? I think let's start with that. That should be an opening, an interesting opening conversation. And we'll start with the brand side, and then we'll hop onto the agency side. So Chandan, over to you. What do you think about it?
Well, thank you, Naved, for setting the scene and the context. And indeed, localization is a very important topic, not just for us, but we see it all over us and everywhere around us. And for us, being a food and beverage company, local is very, very important because all around the world, food is extremely local. People do not eat the same thing if they're in the US or in Europe or in India or China or whatever. Food is extremely local, in the way people consume. There are some foods which travel across boundaries as well. But again, the taste, the adaptation, the cultural context, the nuances, the way it's communicated, the way it's presented, the way it's spiced up, the way it's adapted, and so on and so forth, is also very, very local in its approach. There are some aspects which do remain global, however. So you might have a cup of coffee, which is coffee is a drink which is consumed globally everywhere. But again, the kind of coffee, the taste of coffee, the way it's communicated, the role of coffee in people's lives is not exactly the same. And if you come into India, you would find that coffee has a different meaning in the northern part of the country versus the southern part of the country where coffee is actually grown. So therefore, localization has got many dimensions and many different aspects, and not just in terms of brands, in terms of brand communication, in terms of product development, in terms of how we communicate. And today in this digital world, of course, it goes like you were saying, beyond into how do we localize e-commerce? How do we really localize our influencers and our brand communicators and everybody else who is communicating on the brand? How do you localize even content, communication, packaging, messaging, everything. So therefore, there's a big context. And in Nestle, like many other FMCG companies, we believe that we need to connect with the consumer locally. So therefore, it's very important to also be authentic in the way we communicate. More localization always leads to a stronger connect and a stronger meaning and a stronger recognition of what the role of a brand is. So therefore, localization in all its forms very, very key. In Nestle, we have more than 1,000 brands, and many of the brands are local. There are some global brands that we have, of course, but we adapt them to more local kind of situations and to local contexts. But it's very, very important to stay true to local because there is nothing called the global consumer in that sense of the term. I mean, there are identities which could have some global meaning and so on, but localization is very much, very, very central to the way we look at brands.
Thank you, Chandan. That yes, that does sound quite interesting, and especially like the example you gave, coffee having different connotations for different parts of the world, different parts within a country as well. Chris, what's your take on that? You're a coffee person?
I certainly am, Navid. In fact, I have a cup of the very stuff just here. I should point
Right.
out this is my daughter's mug. She drew one of the frogs,
Right.
which was we received this morning. So it's its debut. It's its debut video call. So yes, I do drink coffee, and I thought that was really beautifully put by Chandan. Actually, that the we have lots of things that are universal, but actually, when you dig into them, the cultural context around them is always quite different. When we work with brands, there are usually, well, every situation is unique, but we're usually moving from a model where they are developing work in local markets to run at the local level, independently of each market. Now, you talked about boundaries, what's a market. We usually talk about linguistic boundaries, so which often go together, but not always. And obviously, that's the case in India, where you've got lots of different languages in one country. But if you talk about a linguistic market, we will work with brands when they are centralizing that work. So they do that. One of the big reasons, of course, is cost efficiency. Rather than working with a local creative agency in 10 different markets, you work with one creative agency, and you then localize that work so that it is suitable for international use. Obviously, that saves money. That also saves complexity as well, because you just have one project that you oversee and that you ensure is exactly what you want it to be. It also helps drive consistency. because your advertising is very, very similar around the world. Your brand shows up in a very, very similar way around the world, and ensures that your customers have the exact same experience of the brand. And then the final one would be speed to market as well. It's a lot more effective way of working. So I think that's the kind of business case for it. And also there is the connection that you have with your audience. So what we do is transcreation, which you mentioned at the start there, Navid, which is a more creative approach to the process. So rather than just translating the words on the page or in the ad or on screen, you're thinking about what is that local culture and what is the target audience there and what is normal there and what do brand communications look like there, and considering all of that. And rather than just doing a straight translation, you're essentially rewriting the copy for something that feels like it's from that part of the world, but is still consistent with the global campaign. And that's really important because as I think Chandan touched on himself, it's about connecting, creating an emotional bond with the audience. And you can't do that if you're speaking in either not in their language at all, or in a way that feels slightly off and feels like a translation and it feels like marketing that's from the other side of the world. And nor can you do that if there's kind of two sides to that. So one is it just feels a bit off, as I say, but the other side is it's about respect for the consumer. It's about respect for their part of the world. It's showing that you understand what is special about whatever that country may be, and that you appreciate that culture as well.
Sure. You bring up some very interesting points to talk about, Chris. Right from transcreation to speaking about why a brand really needs to change their communication yet maintain consistency. So just picking up on that, Chandan, you have a fairly global view to all of this communication and how it really percolates. What's the Nestle way, or how would you think Nestle should or is doing this localization, where one communication is adapted or translated or transcreated for different markets? Does it happen that way? Does it not happen that way? What's been the learning so far?
Well, it depends a lot. It depends a lot on three different things, actually. First of all, and in no particular order, because we actually look at these three things as a triangle, and therefore, there is no one corner of it that is more important than the other. So the first thing we try and, generally look at is to look at the culture. Yeah. Which is to understand, brands, products, categories, everything works in a certain culture. And therefore, we look at the culture, we look at who our target consumer is, what's a deep understanding of the target consumer, what kind of culture does the target consumer reside in. In some cases, we do find in an increasingly digitized world, there are parts of culture which are kind of, cutting across different sections. There are certain aspects which do not necessarily cut across different sections, and therefore we look at that. The second thing is to look at the context, and the context is about what the product or the category or the brand means. What's the local kind of context? How is it consumed? Like I give you the example of coffee. Coffee may mean different things in different places. Similarly, you do have food, for example. The way food is consumed or food that is cooked is quite different, very, very different in different parts of the world. And therefore, that's very different. The context needs to be really understood. And the third one is about your brand, because your brand may, have different ways in which the consumer perceives the brand, or the way in which the brand has got its history or its life cycle entrenched, and the equity of the brand, and so on and so forth. So we do look at, all these three aspects. And in some cases, the same content can go across different kinds of cultures. In some cases, like Chris was mentioning, it needs to be transcreated. And we do sort of, try to push towards transcreation rather than translation, because translation means, in many cases doesn't mean much. You need to really create it and place it in context in a way people understand, in a way people feel about some particular brand or some particular category, and so on. So let me give you an example. If you look at, let's say, Kit Kat, Kit Kat as a brand is present in many countries around the world. Now it's a relatively, in the whole spectrum of food and beverage and the whole spectrum of fast moving consumer goods, maybe a slightly easier case because, chocolate is consumed all across the world. Many categories are consumed all across, many categories may not be consumed all across, but here in this case, chocolates are consumed, in many parts of the world. Of course, they differ in their penetration, their frequency of consumption. Typically we do find Asian countries having a lower per capita consumption than, let's say, Europe or North America or things like that. But that's again, depending on the cultural context. But you have a brand which has got a proposition around have a break, have a Kit Kat. Now, breaks are relevant to everyone around the world. People take
Sure.
breaks. They might be taking breaks in different contexts. Breaks may mean different things to people. And then when you get into, its adaptation to language, then it could also mean very, very different things to people. In terms of what a break is and what they perceive out of a break, and whether it's a long break or a short break, or what they mean around the values and characteristics of a break. So therefore, while it is one brand, Kit Kat, with a kind of a, let's say, a proposition around having a break and having a Kit Kat, and the break proposition can still be very, very relevant across, but we do adapt it in different contexts depending on the target consumer. So you would see our renditions of Kit Kat in the UK being quite different from what it is in India or what it could be in Australia. And the brand stature is also a little bit different. The brand life cycle is also a little bit different in these countries, and so on, or for that matter in Brazil. So therefore, we take into consideration all these three aspects. There is no one formula to decide, how much leeway do you provide, or how much should it be around the core, how much should it be contextualized. It's a combination of these three elements that finally results in what we should really do. But our leaning is always towards localization, and the leaning is always towards making it most relevant for the consumer who is finally going to consume that product, or for who the product or the brand is actually meant, because it doesn't really matter if it is meant for somebody else. It has to be meaningful and relevant for the consumer who we are talking to. So therefore, whether it is adaptation of break as a proposition, or whether it's representation in visual context, or in sort of word context, or the kind of aspects that you bring to life, it's always localized in most cases, rather than having a very single size fitting all kind of an approach.
Awesome. This actually, and very well put, Chandan, because one of the things that we also do as part of, our engagement with clients is something called a language and cultural audit. Now, within India, the many Indias in India, or, so many different languages and regions in India, we realize that, one communication, when you transcreate it, when it's print, it's relatively easier to do. But when you're doing a video, recreating those many formats may not be feasible in that sense. So a lot of times what we're asked to do is to verify whether, for example, even a script that's been written, is vernacular friendly or regional friendly, or a cultural, the cultural nuances of every region are incorporated within that, so that when it actually goes into a voiceover, or you do a subtitling to it, it is still able to relate to the end user, and pretty much in line to with what you were saying, that you have to look at the culture, you have to look at the relatability, and of course lean on transcreation. Chris, a question for you on, when it comes to transcreation. And, I think from a lot of times, a lot of brand managers, when we speak with, we have to start creating this difference between standard translation, copywriting, and transcreation. How would you probably, in a line, or in the simplest manner, explain to to everybody what this possibly means, and how and where what needs to apply?
So transcreation is what we're known for as a business, but we do all of those things. So I'll start by describing kind of what we consider to be transcreation, which is all the stuff that Chandan's talked about there. So considering what's the positioning of the brand in that local market, what are the cultural norms in that part of the world, the cultural touch points, What is the target audience there? Are they slightly different than they might be in the domestic market? And what do brand communications look like generally? So the way in which brands communicate in the UK is quite different to Germany, which is quite different to China, which is quite different to Saudi Arabia, to kind of look at some extremes. And you've got to kind of calibrate the messaging accordingly while still being faithful to the position of the brand globally. So it's about that, you know, ensuring it's consistent but locally sensitive. And when we're trans-creating, we're rephrasing the copy. And we use copywriters, which is quite an easy way of distinguishing it, because it needs to be, talent needs to be the same kind of people who are writing the English in the first place, or whatever the source material would be, which is out and out creatives, because they have that ability to write well and write engagingly, write fluently, you know, write good copy, but they also have that understanding of advertising in their market and can flow that into their work. Right. Whereas for translation, you lose that creativity, and it's something that's going to be a lot closer to the English, where we will often serve clients across 2 or 3 of these services, and when we're delivering translation, it's really where there isn't a requirement for that creativity, because there isn't that much creativity in the English in the first place. Perhaps there isn't the budget. And it's actually not that strategically important, and it just needs to be in the local language. But generally speaking, it will be where the content is informational. So you're just informing the audience of, you know, it might be the details of a product, it might be frequently asked questions, it might be something legal. Whereas for transcreation, it's where you're trying to create an emotional connection with the audience and trigger a response. So whether that is to engage with the brand, to purchase a product, to sign up for something, whatever it may be, you know, probably the difference between advertising and informational content. Copywriting is where you're writing the content from scratch. So where you aren't working from a source language, but generally are going to be, you know, within our space. You're working within quite a tight framework that's already been established, probably by a creative agency, probably by an advertising agency. There's already assets exist, but there isn't something in French, say. We don't need to work from an English master in those cases. We can write something from scratch. So we do a lot of work for Four Seasons, for example, you know, high-end hotels, and they have content that is centralized, that is there. So we localize primarily websites. So each hotel has its own website, and obviously it's, you know, very well written. It's very premium positioning. Attention to detail kind of reflects the positioning of the brand internationally. So there is centralized content that lives across all of their websites, that is trans-created, needs to be beautifully written, needs to feel local, but needs to be consistent with what Four Seasons say all around the world. There is then content that will exist for that website and that website only. And we've done a lot of this in China, particularly, of rather than working from English and saying, okay, how can we make this English into something that the Chinese is going to resonate with a Chinese high-end traveler? Actually, we just start from scratch and just write it for the Chinese, and then transcreate it back into English, because that's the focus. So that will be content that is for a more narrow use case. So where it's only going to live on one website, for example, we'll write that from scratch, or it's going to run in one market only. And then when for Four Seasons again, we will translate the booking system, where it needs to be very close to the English. You don't want something that's particularly creative and that moves away from it. It's there to be correct and to be informative, and kind of no more, no less than that.
Sure, thank you so much. So would you say that transcreation is a fairly new way of looking at localization, and it's probably something that's changed perhaps over the last 5 years, which brands are seeking more now? Yes or no?
Is that me?
Yes.
Yeah, I would say it kind of depends where in the world you are. I've been working in the industry for 17 years now. And in that time, so most of that time at Mothertub, 17 years ago, we didn't really use the word transcreation. We would talk about adapting marketing, and we had to kind of explain to people what it was, and sell them on the idea of what transcreation is. Whereas now, clients come to us because they want transcreation. So there's much more awareness now of what it is, and an appreciation of its impact. What we've seen in the last few years is an absolute explosion in India, where in the past, a lot of the work would be into English for India or into Hindi, and not much else. And there's now much more of an awareness of communicating with more, not all, but 10 plus languages, and connecting more with those audiences, and ensuring that they engage more with the brand, and do all of the things that we want to do through transcreation. Sure.
Chandan, what's your take on that? I mean, in terms of localization, what's changed over the last 5-10 years? What's Nestle seen? What have you seen?
Well, I think we are getting much more conscious about the point that we have to engage more locally and with the local consumer. In some cases, and we have a way to understand if the opportunity really exists or the opportunity is less prevalent. Let us say, for example, and let's say you want to take any particular brand or any particular proposition and decide whether you want to do one language or two languages or 5 or 10 in India, for example. And it depends on, where our penetration is, what our opportunity is, where do we want to go, what are our key sort of areas that we want to connect with, and where do we see the opportunity from a business standpoint, from a consumer standpoint, and so on. And therefore, we have a certain sort of way at looking at whether it should be 1, 2, 3, 5 languages. The objective is to go more and more into more languages as we start looking at the opportunities, more specifically. There are also propositions that we have created for India. So if you look at, a brand like Munch, for example, as a chocolate brand in India, it has been very, very local from its very inception, from the way the brand has been created, the way brand has been thought about, the local ethos, the connect with the Indianness, and everything else is very, very local. And as we take Munch into more and more states in India, into more and more languages in India, again, we try to reflect the local culture, the local nuance. In some cases, things like local festivals, for example, which are quite different and quite significant. And chocolates or Munch has a role to play in these kind of situations. If you look at brands like Maggi, for example, which is a large brand, a really big brand with a big equity in India and so on. We have been also going into more and more languages where we're trying to get into contexts which are more local. Sometimes it's, of course, a decision between, if you go all the way, would you get a better ROI? Would you get a better connect with the consumer? Would you get better, meaning and all of that, versus if you go a little bit leftward and not have all of those elements baked in, but some of those elements baked in, whether you look at into some of the points that you were mentioning, in terms of cast and copy and visuals and nuances around it and different elements. It's always a spectrum. So there is a certain amount of judgment involved, but I think the goal is fairly clear that, for connecting with the consumer, we need to go much more local and much more deep. I think there are no two ways about it. Of course, with digitization that we have seen, over the last few years, and actually during the COVID times, I mean, digital content is so much prevalent today. People are spending more time on digital platforms and so on. And this is, again, this has also led to more kind of, creation of more specific local content, because then, you can actually have the vehicle to go more specific, go more targeted, create that resonance, create that meaning, connect with the consumer in a more authentic way, and so on. So therefore, this has also helped or led in that exercise. If you look at, maybe 20 years ago, when by and large, most of the communication used to be on television and a few other things like print and so on, there could be only perhaps a fewer ways of communicating and going, though of course there were regional channels and so on and so forth. But the avenues were, let us say, more limited. Today, the avenues are very many. And therefore, we have to also kind of, take advantage of the avenues which are there. And that is what has really changed going forward and leading us to more and more localization, more and more contextualization, more and more transcreation, and so on.
And coincidentally, there's a report from Google and KPMG that talks about the penetration of internet, digital content, and its consumption in India. And that report actually said that 90% of users actually consume digital content, and they prefer consuming that content in their vernacular languages. So quite corroborating to what you're saying.
Absolutely. And if I can just add to that, Navid,
Please.
it's not just in the smaller towns or in the different states in the country. If you look at even a city like Delhi,
Yeah.
or a city like Mumbai, or a city, some other, larger city, people also want to connect in their own language. So it's not that, a common language works there. So therefore, it's everywhere and it's omnipresent. And you can see the number of Google searches which are happening in local language and so on. I mean,
Sure.
mind-blowing kind of numbers that we see around us.
Absolutely. And Chris also spoke about this explosion in India of how much translation and brands are getting sensitive to vernacular languages in India. But Chris, and a question to the both of you, because you'd have that perspective. Is India following a trajectory of how it's been done globally in terms of their localization, in terms of their transcreation? Or is India following a completely different trajectory that you've not seen anywhere else? Any of you can pick up that one.
I'm very conscious that I'm sat here in a little village not far from London, speaking to numerous Indian people. So I don't want to make too many sweeping statements about a country I know a lot less about than probably anybody else here. From business perspective, in terms of the trends that we've seen, I think the difference is I think it's been interesting the role that that tech companies have played, and that's probably in terms of our client base where we've seen the most demand for the most number of languages. Because they're all searching for their next billion users, and obviously India has an awful lot of potential users. And if you're a tech company that is fully based online, whether you're an e-commerce or a platform or search engine or all of those things, you have no business if people can only understand some of your content, or you have a very weak business. So there's twofold. There's a commercial need to be able to communicate with people fully, and all the stuff that we talked about for transcreation. Building that relationship with consumers, making them, showing those people that you understand and value their culture. But it's also a lot easier as well, technically, to localize an app into lots of languages than it is to run a print campaign in 15 different Indian languages, and all the logistics around that. So I think from my perspective, I think that's been quite a big catalyst actually, for increasing localization into those into multiple Indian languages. And I think from our perspective, it's a different. Certainly, we've had to evolve our business model a little bit. Whereas we would ordinarily work with experienced copywriters who've been writing advertising for 10 plus years in their local market, in their local language. It's not so easy to find a Gujarati copywriter because historically there perhaps haven't been as much brand communications in that language. So I think perhaps the profile of creatives is slightly different in India than in other markets as well, which I think is quite exciting. But really the biggest difference is the speed and kind of how different things are now compared to 5 years ago.
Sure. Chandan, you want to weigh in on that?
Yeah, well, agree. Things are quite different over the years, and yeah, I mean, there's a lot more opportunity than what's sort of captured or tapped in at this point in time. My sense is that India would follow its own trajectory, in terms of what it does, like in many different aspects. Of course, certain things are common. If you look at the European countries, of course, you have to communicate in the local language, and big brands have also adapted in the right context to kind of, communicate with the local consumer. I think we're going to see more and more of that in India, to also communicate in more languages. There are many more languages out here. And there is, of course, a certain stage of development of the brand and a certain stage of tapping into the opportunity. So I think there's going to be a mix of these three different things. And we see as brands also start going more into the rural hinterland of India, into the different states, and into the lower town classes within the different states, we would see a lot more sort of voice and vernacular and video content, getting much more local. And all this will lead to newer opportunities and so on. Of course, there is the print aspect, which is quite local, and maybe some brands which operate at a national scale, may not be able to tap into every opportunity or into the right opportunities, where some of the local or more the regional brands are able to tap into those opportunities, and they build very, very strong equities in the right way in some of the states and in some of the markets. So it's an evolution process. I think the opportunity is well understood. Um, are we tapping into it totally? Not yet. Is there more room to do? Of course, yes. But we understand that there is a certain potential out there that we have to very clearly sort of go more and more into, and start getting into more stuff. And I think the point of Chris around the right kind of talent is also something to be looked at, and this is
Sure.
talent across. If you want to sort of, have a script which is discussed with a set of agency guys sitting here in Delhi or Mumbai, and then you want to sort of, take it forward into print or digital or TV, in let's say the south of India, somebody has to really bring it alive, and therefore the local talent has to be also there to bring that alive. Otherwise, some of it may get lost, or some of it may not be nuanced enough to understand where things are. Like, for example, if you develop a video content, and the kind of flowers that you talk about are again quite different. The way different flowers are perceived in different states and in the cultural context of India may have different meaning, may have different resonance, may have different equity even. Some are more, let us say, people are more aware of, they signify something and so on, whereas in another part of the country it may have a different significance. So it's understanding of language, it's understanding of culture, it's understanding of all different nuances, and so on. And I think we have to get better and sharper in all of this as we begin to kind of go deeper and deeper into the country.
Right. Sure. One of the things I thought we'll discuss, and which we have also answered partially, is as a marketer today, what are the various challenges that you face? Right. So we've spoken about conveying the meaning. We've spoken about having the right resourcing. We've spoken about understanding the culture. And as to be able to solve this problem for a lot of marketers, we have a model called MILE, which is the Magnon Index for Language Experience. Essentially, what we try and do is, for a marketer, we try and tie up the entire 360-degree experience of a user when they're interacting with the various touch points that a brand has in vernacular. So be it a website, be it the website, be it a mobile app, or the social presence, all of those combined together, are they giving the users the right approach, the right communication? Are they making them feel comfortable? And we help marketers try and solve that. Inputs from you, Chandan, what you think that beyond what we've discussed, anything that you feel is what a marketer faces as a challenge today, and how that should probably be solved by the agencies?
Well, I think you've covered it, Navid. I think the model or the framework would help us get there in terms of understanding and in terms of laying out, what the framework is and so on. I think one of the challenges is the right talent to be able to understand and use it in the right way so that we are able to bring it alive. And also, from our side, or from the brand marketeer side, also having the right talent to be able to get far deeper into the local nuances and to be able to bring that alive. I think that's going to be one very, very key aspect about bringing it alive. It's also a question of, where do you start looking at further opportunities, and where do you start looking at what could be a little more universal in approach. I think that's going to be a question which is there for many brands still, in terms of how far they should dissect, how far they should personalize, how far they should fragment. At one point in time, of course, maybe in the sort of decades to come, everything would be totally personalized in a way where everything talks to almost one-on-one kind of marketing, which is possible in some categories, maybe less possible in some other categories, maybe required in some categories, maybe not so required in some other categories as well. But that's the sort of overall direction that you talk to me, as Chandan, you talk to me in my context, in my language, in my culture, and try to bring in meaning that is relevant and resonating with me. And therefore, that nuancing of understanding will be very key. In some cases, I may not, sort of appreciate that, or that may not be a driver for absorbing something or getting into something. But I think there is much more sort of, understanding that we really need to kind of, build in and go forward. Like if you go into any particular state, for example, if you go to any of the North Indian states, you would find context also changing. And therefore, once you start of, getting into, let's say, the river Ganges in Uttar Pradesh, one side of the Ganges versus the other side of the Ganges, there are, of course, different cultural contexts. Now, should we cut it that way? Is that meaningful for a brand to tap into? Maybe in some categories for some brands where they actually look at opportunities in that specific way, maybe it's relevant. Maybe there are different dimensions to look at over there. And, even within a certain vernacular context, it's not that everybody in that vernacular context is in the same cultural realm. So therefore, it's about, how far do we personalize, how far do we fragment, how far do we target more specifically versus, how far we become a little broader. But I think the opportunity very much exists. And if you're not tapping into it, we're definitely leaving money on the table.
Sure. Some notes for us on the agency side there. Thank you so much, Chandan. Chris, what's your take on that? On the agency side, what's the what's the marketer looking for? How can we help? How do we make it better for them?
I mean, in simple terms, what a marketer is looking for to generate more sales and have a happier customer base. So, we kind of talked about how we do that, and actually the nuts and bolts of it, of people need to understand your messaging in order to react to it, but also to respond to it as you wish, but also the unspoken implicit thing of I'm actually talking to you in your language. And I'm, making reference to the things that are important in your culture or whatever it may be, and showing that value and appreciation for that. I think it's a really good point what Chandan was saying of how far do you go with that, because it's you can always go deeper, always. Whether you start looking at a country and you look at, say, that to move it outside of India, we say the German-speaking region of Europe. So okay, well, we'll go for Germany, and actually Austria and Switzerland. It's more or less the same. We'll do one version, but then actually you could do a Swiss version and an Austrian version, or you could also get quite Swiss language, Swiss German's quite vernacular, and you can get very, very localized with that. But then actually you think, well, people in northern Germany speak quite different to people in southern Germany and things. And then how far do you want to go? And obviously there's a balance to be struck between what's it's about what your return on investment is, and at some point you get to the stage of actually this would be lovely, but it's not feasible. We talk a lot with brands who operate in Latin America, and there's perhaps some parallels with India, not too many, but you have a lot of different regions within, if you look at Spanish-speaking South America, for example, every country speaks Spanish differently. Every country has its own slang and local cultural references and things like that. And in an ideal world, you'd cater for every single one of those. But actually, in practice, a lot of communication, certainly if you look at TV, and a lot of online stuff as well, is pan-regional. So it becomes quite difficult to customize the messaging. And actually, if you start to do that, then you can potentially alienate, an audience in Mexico is very different to an audience in Argentina, which is very different to an audience in Colombia. So often we find that actually, there's an aspiration to be able to cater for all of these audiences, but in practice, it's like, well, actually, I think we're just going to, play it more safe and just have a more neutral tone. And it's, we operate within a business commercial environment where you have to be pragmatic. So we absolutely appreciate the value of that. I think my advice to brands when they are transcreating content is to expect some, bake in some flexibility, because while most copy challenges can be fixed at the end, you can rewrite the text of an ad and move away quite, if the English is not going to work, you can move away from that. It's not too difficult. It becomes a lot harder with visuals, and if you have a word play in the English and that word play is reflected in the visual of the ad, then that is really hard. And actually, you're at a stage there, you can't really fix it if you're the last stage in the process. So we would also encourage brands to bring in a local market voice earlier on in the ideation process or conceptual stage, and just do a sense check of whether this idea is going to resonate and it's going to travel well. And if not, what can be done to fix it? Because actually, it's usually quite easy to fix at that stage, but it becomes a lot harder once the work has been produced. So stuff like, Chandan talked about at the start, food is such a big one, is really, really different between markets, and just depictions of the home, how we kind of all live behind our closed doors is very different. Sure. Representations of kind of diversity is an interesting one, because they're quite different, between the US and the UK and India, for example. What is a good diverse group of people? It's going to be quite different, and brands can sometimes fall in the trap of you want to please everybody and you end up pleasing nobody. You play it safe and you come up so safe for something that's diverse. Okay, well, we'll have one person of every ethnicity. Isn't that great? But actually it ends up not really feeling like it is anywhere. And although it might not be offensive to anybody, nor is it particularly engaging for anybody either. So to bake in some flexibility around the imagery that you use, around the way in which you execute the idea, is really important. And also to have that local voice, yes, at the start of the process, and whether that local voice, it comes from the brand itself and their local marketeers, or whether it comes from their agency partners or somebody else, it's not so important. But I think at the end, and certainly the approvals, we would always really recommend that the client brings in their local marketing team into the process and make sure they have a voice, because often they can feel a little bit disengaged if they previously had their own relationship with their own creative agency and ran their own advertising, and that's then been centralized. So it's important to get them to buy into the process. That's a good way of doing it. Make sure that they know that their voice is heard. But more importantly, it's about just delivering great work that they really love. And there's so much that you can do in terms of brand immersions and ensuring everybody has a really deep understanding of how that brand likes to show up in that market. But there's only so much you can codify, and we always find there's an awful lot comes out of the back and forth that you have during the approval process. So I always say, when we start a new business relationship, we welcome feedback and we really encourage it. And please don't see it as a failure of the system. This is kind of what the system looks like, and actually it's really part of the process. Certainly in the first few months of a campaign, and just really understanding the nuances between different markets and different brands, if you're working with a Nestle or different categories.
Sure, thank you. So last 10 minutes of the session. So what we'll do is we'll pick up a few questions, and we have a nice audience going. So we have a question for Chandan, and this is, how does Nestle measure the effectiveness of vernacular content while promoting their products in tier 2 and tier 3 markets in India?
So whenever we have more specific vernacular content deployed in certain markets, we try to look at the effectiveness more specifically, both in terms of what is the impact on brand equity as well as in terms of sales. We believe that, while many things have changed in the world of content, I think fundamentally two things remain very, very important as ever, that brand communication or brand content needs to increase, long-term brand equity and sales. And so therefore we measure it in these terms, in terms of the affinity that the brand creates because of more specific vernacular content, and also at the same time whether it's going to give us the uplift in sales and our consumers, feel more excited, or whatever the image or other elements that we are looking for as objectives of a piece of communication.
Sure. All right, we have another question here from Tripti, which is essentially, and Chris, you might want to take this one. When it comes to translation, AI, especially machine translation, is contributing there. Do you believe that soon technology will be capable enough to handle the demand for transcreation too?
It's remarkable the progress that has happened over the last couple of years, has continued to happen with machine translation. And I think a lot of people in jobs like mine have kind of like, wow, what does this mean for us? And you kind of inevitably, some people get a little bit defensive about it. I think now quite an interesting point as an industry, and people are a lot more comfortable about it, and there's more of a consensus on where it sits and what's possible and what's not possible. And I think it's widely accepted that transcreation is going to be very, very difficult for a machine to do effectively, because it is a creative process. You aren't translating a thing. That what you start with, or what you receive is your source content, is really a starting point. And then you're writing something off the back of that, when you do it properly. So, a machine is no more capable of doing that than it would be of writing a book. And in theory, that might happen, but in practice, we're quite a long way off that. For translation, I mean, it's already here, and it's already a really, really big part of the industry, where there isn't a need for that creativity, and where you are communicating for informational purposes. Yeah, why not? I mean, it's, the cost savings are really significant, but it has to be done in if you're a brand, you don't want to undo all of that lovely equity that has been built up over years. And if you're publishing raw machine translation, i.e. something that hasn't been reviewed before it's been published, that has the scope to go very wrong and create all sorts of headaches. So while the AI engine is a huge part of translation, there is still a role for humans in it. It's just a different role than what it was 10 years ago.
Okay, sure. So translation is here to stay, and it will work. It's already working. It's a big component of the industry. Transcreation, unlikely, is the key takeaway there.
I would say so. Where there's a big creative idea, I think that's very hard to automate.
Sure. Chandan, another question, I think, as a follow-up to what we was asked earlier, is up to what extent is the investment making sense for a brand when they're going vernacular, and how do you really measure that? Because a lot of times, we've heard with a lot of brands when we're starting out is, well, let's try one language. And it might end up being a language which is collectively, I think as a nation, we are 22 recognized languages. There's so much to do when you go vernac, that maybe one language may not really give that effect or that output. So what's the decision making, and how do you really evaluate the investment that is being done towards vernacular content and translation localization?
So our sort of primary factor that we look at is the size of the opportunity. If there is a sizable size of the opportunity out there, if there is a meaningful size which we are not kind of responding to or catering to with a certain language, and if the size is good enough or large enough, then of course we go more vernacular. so that it can be tapped into. For example, just as an example, let's say in the South Indian states, you have, let us say, do you want to have a very specific thing for Telugu in Andhra? Well, if you were to go to Andhra Pradesh or Telangana, you have to communicate in Telugu. I think many brands in India have already crossed that boundary that, you have to go more specific insofar as specific languages are concerned. Because it's a sizable state and it's got a good opportunity, there's a good, consumer base out there, might be meaningful for a brand. And of course, not all categories and not all brands are equally penetrated over there. So if it's sizable as an opportunity, of course, it makes sense to go there. In some cases, one may think that, okay, it's not that sizable, I'm more image oriented, or I'm trying to still build something more universally, and therefore, people don't still go that full hog, or maybe they are using a line like have a break, have a Kit Kat, which is still in English, and hope and believe that, maybe people understand that in that context because it's simple enough or, short enough and those kind of things. But generally our overall metric is around the size of the opportunity and how well are we able to really respond and connect with that. If the size is good and if it's a good opportunity for our growth and a good opportunity to take things forward, then we generally try to go and use vernacular or any other form of connecting with consumers in that context.
Right.
Also including voice or video or other aspects, but trying to communicate as much as possible in the local language.
Fair point. Fair point. So size of the opportunity, essentially the key takeaway there. Sure.
Yeah.
Well, I think we're out of time. So, let me take the opportunity to thank you so very much for joining in for the session. I think it was a lovely session, lovely inputs from the both of you. Thank you so much. Over to you, Bhakti.
Yes, thank you, Chris. Thank you, Chandan. Thank you, Naveed, for joining us. And it was it was great to have you as a part of the India International Brand Summit. And your insights, I'm sure, were really helpful to a lot of people. And to our audience, thanks a lot for streaming in. And do tune in tomorrow as well. We have 2 more insightful sessions lined up for you. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Take care.
Thank
you,
you.
folks.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks.